You may have seen the last one of these, so welcome to the slightly more structured 10 underrated things in retro gaming. Just like with the last video, I won't be mentioning any games as points on the list, but I will be using games as examples to embolden my arguments. Basically, I won't say that the underrated thing is a random video game, but I may say that it's a concept. Or similar. Trust me, it'll be good. Anyways, yeah, just look at the last list. If you have anything you disagree with, tell me down below. These are my opinions. If you don't like them, I'm sorry. I specifically picked out stuff that I feel isn't mentioned that much, because I don't want to just, you know, mention the Sega Saturn 10 times. Anyways, yeah, let's begin. Number 10. Retro game manuals, strategy guides, and similar side bits are often ignored when people play some older games. You see, back during the SNES, and especially the NES era, games were just made overcomplicated to sell you strategy guides. Similarly, many things that seemed confusing in the game were explained in the manual. Some games included maps and such, and strategy guides were basically the reason you would buy Nintendo Power. These side bits often get ignored because oftentimes people just download a ROM of the game and start playing it with no manual, with no help, with no nothing. Back in the day, you would just, you know, look at the manual, look at a strategy guide, ask your friends. And nowadays, instead of people just looking up the manual or strategy guide, they just Google a walkthrough and beat the game that way. And while there's no real problem with that, knowing how to actually utilize the materials the game gives you just ends up making the game feel more satisfying to play, and I think it's something people just don't do as much. Number 9. Another huge thing which people tend to forget is that retro games, actually shipped finished. Now, of course, patching games is fucking great. So many old games just ship buggy as shit, because the only way you can patch a bug is to release a new cartridge or disc revision. But back in the day, you'd never run into a situation where you would magically lose content at some point. Like, hey, in Drive Club on the PS4, parts of the single-player game are just blocked off once the servers went offline. Meanwhile, in retro games, what you see is what you get, most of the time. Yeah, SegaNet doesn't really work anymore, though they did make a Dream Pipe. And, a few MMOs like Final Fantasy XI on the PS2 don't work properly anymore. But basically, almost all retro games are still fully functional. Number 8. Another hugely underrated aspect of older games is accessibility. Granted, a lot of these older games don't have colorblind settings or similar, but they have an advantage which so many modern games lack. They're just far easier to pick up, play, and understand than so many big AAA games. So many modern games just give you so much stuff you need to do before you can roam free that often older games are just so far easier to get into. I mean, if you would compare GTA 5 and San Andreas, in order to run around in San Andreas, you have to mash the spacebar a few times to go through the intro cutscene. In GTA 5, you need to go through the prologue, then the first mission, some cutscenes. It just takes far more time. Of course, neither approach is superior, in my opinion at least, but that simplicity that older games have, I feel just isn't really valued as much. Though sometimes it is the reverse and they overvalue it. But still. Number 7. Another very underrated thing is basically any less popular game on basically every system. On almost any system, there are 4 categories of games. The big popular ones people talk about because they're good, the big popular ones people talk about because they're bad, the ones that are rarely, if ever, talked about, And the ones that were previously rarely ever talked about, but then some hidden gem reviewer actually did the game justice and showed people that it's good. Basically, every console has a ton of games released for it, but most people only really look into the most popular stuff a system has to offer. And that most popular stuff is often extremely good, or very rarely extremely bad. Because of that, a ton of games that are still really fun aren't really looked at. Like, Earthseeker was translated on the Wii, and it's a brilliant game, but nobody talks about it. You should play it. Anyways, yeah, like, for a whole reason, there's many reasons, right? But sometimes games just get overlooked. They released in a shadow of a much more popular game, whatever. And so people just kind of skip over them. And while hidden gem reviewers are often a good source of these kinds of recommendations, there are always games they haven't gotten to, and sometimes it's just worth clicking through a library and finding if there's maybe something you like. Number 6. Another very underrated thing are RPGs, and especially JRPGs. They're often just ignored. It's kinda similar-ish to the last point, but it's really genre-specific. Like, when people look back at, like, the SNES, they think of Super Mario World, Super Metroid, and other similar-ish games. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy VI sold more copies than F-Zero, Pilot Wings, Aladdin, Super Street Fighter, but people just don't talk about it as much. This is partially because the most popular JRPG people know of is Pokemon, and while it requires basic reading skills, I am convinced the average Pokemon fan lacks those skills because from my experience they just mash through all the text boxes and then say every single story is the same after not engaging with any of it. So RPGs have this sort of skill flaw where you need to actually read, and because of that, they're kind of vastly underrated by people who don't like reading, because they like arcadey actiony whatevers. You should probably learn how to read. Number 5. Similarly to the last point in another genre that's fucking forgotten forever, strategy games, especially RTS games. Your StarCrafts, your Warcrafts, your Age of Empires, your Command and Conquers, your Swines, there's quite a few of them. RTS games were kinda huge in the 90s and also the early 2000s, partially due to the South Korean gaming market, but it seems like a lot of retro gaming fans ignore this genre even more than they ignore RPGs. This is often because a lot of the retro gaming stuff focuses on consoles, and strategy games are like often extremely obtuse and difficult to get into, even more so with the limited controls on consoles, so it's not that surprising. But still, if you're willing to actually learn at least one of these games, considering how many of them have some kind of map generator, and how many, for instance, even in Age of Empire 1, how many different civilizations, scenarios, scenario builders, all the things you can do, they're a nearly limitless source of fun. Number 4. Number 4 applies more to retro gaming YouTube, but looking into old hardware, specifically game hardware, along with reading into the actual experience the developers had with that hardware, maybe the developers, homebrew developers, etc. All of that is extremely valuable in understanding the hows and whys of older consoles. If you've seen my PS1 versus Nintendo 64 video, I, on many occasions, went into quite a bit of depth into how these systems worked, and especially in my second video, what caused the games to look different, and what magic trickery some of the developers used to get the most out of their hardware, and also why, you know, the games were designed the way they were designed. This is, I feel, vastly underrated because most YouTubers I've seen often just kind of show off the visuals of those games and leave it at that, but they rarely actually go into depth about why the games look like they did past some very vague explanations, and that kind of leads them to an unrealistic expectation or misunderstanding of why these systems performed like they did, and I feel like actually doing research into this is vastly underrated. Like, when I heard Doom on the Sega Mega Drive at Genesis, the sound in that system may have sounded like ass for Doom, but like, I wasn't surprised. I was like, wow, that's a really good rendition, because I know the limitations that the Sega Mega Drive had. It basically used FM synthesis and not MIDI. And just hearing the music translated into FM, it sounds good for FM, but I see so many people say the sound was bad, and stay confused as to why it was bad. I see people look at the Doom Jaguar port and not understand why it didn't have music, because they were never told the underlying reasons for why it was the way it was. And I feel like actually knowing that is underrated. Anyways, Number 3, okay, so the 5th generation of systems is vastly underrated. I'm making something about this. Specifically, the so-called early 3D generation. So many really cool and fun games came out during this time. It was really experimental. You had tons of different interpretations of how to use this new hardware, what to do with it. But it's often just kind of the odd one out. People just mention like the 3D platforms that came out, say arcade games existed on the Sega Saturn, and then maybe say, ah yeah, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear Solid, PlayStation 1, and then they just forget about it. This generation has so many really cool games that honestly far fewer people talk about or even consider, even on the Nintendo 64. It's a very underrated generation, though possibly not the most underrated, but definitely, actually no, it is the most underrated, because the next generation is underrated because it's kind of new. This one is underrated because people just forget about it. Number 2. Okay, so the 7th generation, you know, the DS, PSP, Wii, PS3, 360, it's just wildly underrated. The DS and PSP had a very interesting proposition to so many developers. You could develop some really cool games on these handhelds in 3D with a pretty small budget. And so they did. The PSP was a huge treasure trove for RPGs. The DS had a ton of games, some abysmally dogshit, but some brilliant. I have a video on this, but the only thing that would have made these two handhelds better would have been dual sticks on both. The Wii itself only really has its casual side talked about, with maybe 1 or 2 serious games being a footnote people bring up from time to time. But there are just so many really cool games that people just don't talk about because they came out on the supercharged GameCube. Similarly, the 360 and PS3 are often thought about as either the Halo and Gears of War box, or the Metal Gear Solid and Uncharted box, and then later maybe The Last of Us, depending on if you're, you know, Team Green or Team Blue. However, I am Team Teal, Team Hatsune Miku, and both of these games have a, similarly to the DS and PSP, a truly fucking massive library of very underrated and cool games. Hell, the 360 has some really cool exclusive JRPGs. Something truly shocking to see on a fucking Xbox, especially considering what they're doing today. But that was the reality of the mid-2000s. You know, before the Kinect sabotaged the 360's later years so hard, it also sabotaged their next console's life, and the next console's life. You know, thanks Microsoft. Because, you know, right now, we're just about seeing people who were playing these systems as kids actually grow up and feel nostalgia for them. It's happening with the Wii first, because the Wii had a much younger audience, but hey, it's gonna happen, trust me. And, once that properly happens, soon, I mean, hell, we're seeing kids nostalgic about the fucking PS4 today, And it kinda hits me with whiplash. You know, like, we move forward, time moves forward, we turn into dust, whatever.
Number 1!
The most underrated thing in all of retro gaming is not following the fucking meta, just playing whatever you like. You just dig through a system's library, find something that catches your eye for whatever reason, and trying to play it. Too often has retro gaming turned into a checklist of, oh, I have to play this game, and this game, and this game. It's like a fucking checklist. People load up like Mario 64, maybe get like 3 stars and think, wow, so this was Mario 64. Then they'll play The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time until they exit Kakariko Village. They'll play Resident Evil 1 until they've shot at the first fucking zombie and think, wow, that's so deep. But they'll never actually engage with any of these games properly, because to them it's just a checklist of games they'll boot up to see and then leave. It's this kind of annoying non-commitment, which just kinda sucks because it entirely makes people depend on the first impressions the games give them, so they never actually have a proper experience. And because there are services like Nintendo Switch Online, or just like the Oceans of ROMs Online, where there's kind of choice paralysis where people don't know what to play. Hell, if you have a large collection of real-life games, or like emulator ROMs, it may actually be difficult to actually pick what you want to play. One way which you can solve this, the way I've helped myself, is by having the form of commitment called YouTube. But overall, like, just find a game you like the look of and look it up on YouTube to see if it's sorta like something you would enjoy, and then just fucking play it, man. Come on, it's not that hard. I hope you enjoyed the list. If you feel like everything I said was wrong and every single entry should be like a Madden release or like an NBA release from like the PS2, because those are the most underrated things, you can correct me in the comments, but like, thanks for watching. Earthseeker for the Wii, there's an English translation patch. You should play it. You may be the 3rd person who finishes that game. Bye-bye!